Let's go ahead and get started. How is everyone today? Great. Another good week. I'm gonna take attendance really quickly. Raquel, shift into a new topic, but before we do that, I just want to make sure everyone has a good grasp on ethical formalism, utilitarianism, ethics of care, and ethics of virtue. Are there any general questions on those? So when I say deontological, what does that refer to?
Ethical systems that are based on formal, like morality and um, good questions of like formal, like
Yes, but not, it's more broad. So when we're looking at systems, you're usually focused on one or the other,
okay, so this one's focused more on the individual, right?
the action itself. So
Right.
deontological systems is referring to systems, including ethical formalism, that just focus on the action. But we don't use that. We don't use, like, when I ask you to resolve a dilemma, you can't say deontological. That's not correct. That's just a way to categorize them. So on the other end, then, teleological refers to what? Yes. So like utilitarianism, where you're just focused on creating the greatest number of happiness for the greatest number of people, that's a teleological system. So it's focused on the action versus the outcome. So ethical formalism, uh, I would also say like ethics of care fall into deontological. Teleological is utilitarianism and ethics of virtue, because ethics of virtue, although we are focused on being virtuous, it's all about producing a good life. So that's why it's deontological, because you're really focused on the outcome of your virtues, not necessarily like, oh, I'm just being virtuous. But once again, specifically, when I say resolve a dilemma, it's going to be those four: ethical formalism, utilitarianism, ethics of care, ethics of virtue. I don't care which one you use. You can use the same one all semester, whatever resonates with you, but you have to apply it correctly. So with like ethical formalism, you can't just say I acted out of my duty and it's correct. You have to name those categorical imperatives. You have to apply it. Same thing with ethics of care. You can't just say, oh, I was focused on relationships, so it was correct. No, you have to describe how did you maintain that relationship? Were there relationships that were harmed? You have to get specific. So make sure, so like that first lecture that we went through, like I said, I would keep that handy, because you will be applying those theories throughout the semester. I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear. Okay, perfect. So today, we are talking about, after test one, we'll start getting into like specifics where we're really like breaking dilemmas down, for law enforcement, legal, corrections. But we're still kind of in the theoretical realm. And today we're going to talk about how ethics applies to the creation of laws and how it guides bodies of laws and standards within society. Because that's one important thing about ethics, is that it helps guide laws. And we know for civilized progressive society, having a body of law that is fair, and treats everyone equally is, what we're striving for. But it hasn't always played out that way. So, um, and once again, this theory will not be used for the dilemmas, but it's just to understand, uh, you know, how laws came about, the sort of like theoretical understanding behind it. So John Rawls, who is another pretty well-known modern philosopher, developed a theory of justice that emphasizes the rights of individuals. So his theory is not really concerned with individual interactions, it's more so concerned with governing institutions. Um, what's an institution? When I say that word, what does that mean? What are we referring to?
Courts, prison.
Yeah, so it's like any public system of rules which defines positions, offices, and also lays out like the rights, the duties, powers, immunities. So a university is an institution, a court system, criminal justice system, the educational system, K through 12, that's its own institution. Banks are institutions. So any entity that has a public system of rules where there's a sort of hierarchy. And so when I talk about the theory of justice, John Rawls, that's what we're focused on. How institutions act ethically. Because institutions also, they're made up of individuals, but as we know from, like, if you follow, federal law or just legal things in general, we know that institutions can be held liable. They're treated like individuals sometimes by a court system, corporations. And so that means that they also can behave in a way that's either good or bad. But it's very different than looking at one person because it's a collective sort of thing. But the theory of morality that sets out the principles governing our sense of justice is what we are concerned about. It's the principles that kind of guide us.
Like laws, right?
Yes, yeah, essentially. So yeah, principles, ethics, but those gets translated into laws and policies. So we're really concerned here with acting on the principles rather than just looking at the consequences or someone's individual character. We want to know if someone acted within the sort of standard, within the rules that have been written to guide that institution. So even countries, if you want to look at it that way, are sort of like institutions. We have, a Declaration of Independence. We have a Constitution, a Bill of Rights. All those things, set out the sort of standards and ideals, the norms of behavior that we've set out, for this country. So, although we're not really focused on individual people, there's still this need to understand what makes up a moral person because, once again, institutions are just collective, they're just made up of individual people in the collective sense. So that means that within this theory of justice, you have to understand and have a concept of what is good. You also have to have the capability of possessing a sense of justice, meaning that you can kind of internalize it and allow that to guide your behavior. And so in general, that's what constitutes a moral person under this theory. Just being able to recognize what is good and being able to like internalize it and use it. So in order to create any sound institution, a society, a university, a bank, whatever it is, you have to develop moral capabilities necessary to create such a society. And you have to, the individuals that are making up the institution, they have to agree on those governing principles. Very much like, what happened with the American Constitution. Same thing. Just group of people got together and decided that these are our values, this is what we're emphasizing, this is how we're moving forward to create this governing body. So according to John Rawls, then, there are individuals that are in what is called an original position. Who are those people in the original position?
What do you mean by original position?
Well, that's what I'm asking you. You guys should have read.
What do you mean like, like people in power?
No, kind of the opposite.
Okay.
So who are the people that are not in power?
Us.
Yeah, just everyday men and women, ordinary talents and tastes. That's the definition according to John Rawls. But just everyday people, you and me, everyday citizens. Those are the people in the original position. And but it's important to base the governing rules, laws around that sort of population, because according to John Rawls, they have what is called this veil of ignorance. What is the veil of ignorance? What is good about being ignorant? Because that word kind of carries a negative connotation, but that saying ignorance is bliss, there's some truth to that. So why would it be good to have ignorant people kind of being the standard, to set the standard of any governing institution?
If you're the governing institution, you have trouble getting those things instead of doing whatever it is you want.
True, yes. But if we're thinking of creating like a sound, safe, just institution, why would you want to base it on just ordinary men and women and not, people that are like in power or super duper rich people?
It's like morality and things like that. Like if you have people who are just like regular everyday people who can have more consensus on what's right and what's wrong, whereas we have people who maybe start to question it a little more, or like question what society deemed as moral, they might feel more inclined to deviate.
Yeah, exactly. So John Rawls argues that it's important to have these people in the original position because that veil of ignorance pretty much ensures that no one will gain advantage or suffer disadvantage because of his or her particular circumstances.
There'd be like, I would say, not like equal power, but
Yeah, in a way, like it's like producing a pathway so you can create laws and governing principles that are equal, that treats everyone equally, and it's not just like for this certain class, this certain race at this certain time, but it's for everyone. And once again, those are those are the ideals that this country was founded upon, even if it hasn't always been applied that way. From a theoretical sense, I mean, a lot of the American values are very much aligned with Rawls's theory of justice. So and these are important because he argues that if parties are rational and they only act in self-interest, that they're naturally going to choose the principles of social justice. What are those principles? They're in your book. You may refer to your chapter 16. Reading is part of this class. You are a student. You can't get away from the reading. And I will stand here until someone makes. So what is the difference principle? Or no, that's not it. Sorry, that's another thing. What is that?
Harmony and cooperation.
Yes. So is that the first one that you're stating?
Yes.
It's more specific though. There should be a more specific definition. Person has a right to what? Maybe the first one, but this is part of your class participation, so don't make each person is to have an equal right, basic liberty, compatible with liberty for others. That should sound very familiar, right? That's very, once again, American Constitution, that's the ideals we have. So like political liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, liberty of conscience, freedom of thought, right to property, freedom from arbitrary arrest and seizure. Those are all freedoms that we have in this country that align with that first principle that everyone has equal rights to the basic liberty of their, neighbors, their counterparts. All right, that's number one. What's the second principle?
Social and economic inequalities are to be arranged so that they are both A, reasonably expected to be everyone's advantage, and B, attached to positions and offices open to all.
Yes, perfect. So in a more, layman's terms, that essentially means that social and economic opportunities need to be available to everyone. Everyone should have equal access. And that if you are in a position of power, once again, those positions and offices are open to all. So once again, that should sound very familiar. It's very much, based on the ideals of, what this country was built on. So everyone has an equal right to basic liberty, and social and economic opportunities are open to everyone. Everyone has it. So if, for example, if you wanted to be a mayor, and let's say you're a woman of Japanese descent, you should be able to have the same opportunity as a man that's Swedish descent. So everyone is equal. Everyone has the same opportunities, same potential. Let's put it that way. So those are the two basic principles of social justice. Very basic. A lot of countries have built, especially like Western countries, have built their society around those ideals. So, principles of social justice, they apply to the basic structure of society. Now, this is where the difference principle plays in. Remind me your name again, Adidas shirt?
Christian.
Christian, that's right. Would you like to tell the class what the difference principle is?
Yes, so the difference, the difference principle would apply naturally to inequalities arising from the creation of new job.
Yes. So in other words, it's a mark of social justice, and it just refers to any act that promotes equality, and it's justified as long as it does not worsen the situation of the disadvantaged. So that means that you always need to have the disadvantaged group's needs in mind. So you can't create laws that are just going to benefit, if we're talking about like income, for example, that's the easiest thing. You cannot, according to the theory of justice and the social justice principles, you cannot create laws and standards that are going to disadvantage people in lower income brackets. So if you have like tax breaks that just benefit, higher earning individuals, according to John Rawls, that's not just, that's not fair, because you need to be creating laws that benefit disadvantaged groups. You can't be thinking about the advantaged groups and trying to have them prosper and then have other groups not prosper. It has to be equal across. Yes.
We have three different kinds of social classes. So you're saying that with this principle, all three of them, one class can't have an advantage over the other one, but all three of them have to have the same advantages.
Yes. So if you create a law that promotes equality and it promotes, once again, like a tax break, it's only justified if it doesn't put burden on lower income people. But if it's a tax break that helps those individuals, but also helps everyone else as well, that's okay.
What about upper class?
It's okay as long as it's not negatively affecting disadvantaged groups.
Oh.
Yeah, so that's the only time that something like that would not be okay. If it's just benefiting upper class but not helping anyone else or making someone's situation worse. That make sense?
Yeah. So basically, it sounds like it's more of the lower class.
Yeah, that's what, according to John Rawls, that's what you need to keep in mind. You're not creating laws to benefit people that are already prospering and are abundant. And then that doesn't mean that you forget about them. But he's just making the point. Kyle, are you paying attention? He's just making the point that when you are thinking of creating an institution, governing laws, your mind has to be on disadvantaged groups and not the people that are in power. It kind of goes back to, the original position, the veil of ignorance. It's just maintaining that, or it's just ensuring that you're creating laws that are aligned with people's general self-interest. And like most rational people would see that and be like, okay, that's good, that makes sense. So yeah, we kind of talked about the social inequalities. And the way, and it also, even though this theory, you can't really apply it to individual behavior, it is very much aligned with Immanuel Kant, ethical formalism, because the difference principle also prevents from using people as a means to an end. Like, once again, you're not taking advantage of people, you're not putting laws that are going to make one group suffer and another one prosper. You are, putting in place laws and rules that, in theory, are going to help benefit everyone. And that's how it relates to ethical formalism, because you're not treating people as a means to an end. You're just focused on them as the end because you want to benefit everyone. But although we are concerned with, not creating laws that put one group at a disadvantage versus others, what about the distribution of wealth and income? According to John Rawls, it doesn't need to be equal. But if that's the case, it has to be to the advantage of all. And once again, positions of authority and power, they need to be accessible to everyone. So it makes sense that maybe you're going to pay, a heart surgeon a little bit more than someone who works at HEB, cashier. And that doesn't mean that one person is better than the other, but one position requires a lot of school, they work long hours, it's stressful, it's literally like life or death a lot of times. The other position doesn't require an educational background. It could be stressful, but it might not necessarily be stressful. The hours may not be that crazy either. And so it's okay if people are not paid the same given their job. But once again, it has to be the advantage of all. You're not going to underpay, someone if it doesn't align with the amount of work they're putting in and or the amount of work that was required to get to that position. It needs to be aligned and it needs to be fair. But that doesn't mean that you have to treat everyone the same in terms of like how much they're getting paid and the wealth. But once again, it has to be the advantage to all. And so, like, for example, if only certain people can become doctors, which was true at some point in this country, like, if you're a woman, forget about it. If, you weren't white, forget about it. Even in universities, being, a student at a university, those spaces historically have not always let everyone in. And so that's where it's problematic, is when people are barred access to certain positions. But if you're fine being an Uber driver, there's nothing wrong with being an Uber driver. You're going to get compensated given your position, the role, and all of that. So therefore, any departure from that equal liberty, the principle one, it has to be justified by greater social and economic advantage. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, let's talk about justice as fairness. So obviously this theory is very abstract. A lot of the theories that we talk about in this class are abstract. But it's a good way not only to help you think, but to just give you a sense of the things that we should be striving for, even if a lot of times it doesn't happen that way because, social progress is slow. Creating an equal and progressive society is also slow and hard. It takes, as you can see, hundreds and hundreds of years sometimes. So John Rawls did not create this theory with intention to have it, actually be used and people establish principles for a particular society or government. It was more on a hypothetical basis to just kind of show the principles that free and rational people would accept. And I would say most, democratic, Western, even like there's Asian countries, Middle Eastern countries, African, South American. It's global. But there are countries globally that a lot of their laws, their constitutions, they just align naturally with this theory because there are principles that any rational person would, agree that is important. And especially in this country, like a lot of our theories, our principles, align with the theory of justice. But essentially, this is just a theory to demonstrate that social cooperation is possible, that it can take place, and that justice needs to be equated to fairness. It's not just a way for people to get power, to just use that word, to just, push their agenda. But justice as fairness, it communicates the idea that principles of justice are agreed to an initial situation that's considered fair. Like, for example, the Bill of Rights. Most people would agree that those are pretty fair. We want those rights to be protected. All right. Any questions so far? Oh, no, you're fine.
But will you please tell us the two principles of social justice? You said one was equal liberty. What was number two?
The second one was positions of power and all offices, they need to be available and accessible to everyone.
So you're basically saying that anybody has an equal chance of getting into power.
Yes. So if you wanted to go on and be a heart surgeon or the president of the United States or a mayor, a professor, no matter your position, whether you were born in poverty or not, whether you were born to immigrant parents or not, whatever your social position is, you will have access and you will be able to do that if you want it.
Those kind of positions take years to.
Yeah, yes, but the whole idea is to ensure that everyone has access to it. Because that's not the truth a lot of times, in this country especially. Like, for example, if you are in a jurisdiction where the school system isn't that great, you're not getting a lot of taxes going towards your school, you're not getting a lot of help. And so a lot of options are to either go to that school and not get a good education, or hopefully be able to get, into another school in another county or whatever it is. When I was in high school, that was the case in Atlanta. Like, we would have people coming from South Fulton because the schools down there sucked up to North Fulton so they can get a good education. But that shouldn't be the case. They should be able to stay in their communities and have access to the same education as people in North Fulton County were getting. And so that's just one example, because ideally you want everyone to have access to the same level of education, same quality of education. But we know that doesn't happen because a lot of it is based on taxpayer money, where you're living, and all that.
So it depends on going back to social class as well.
Yes, yeah. So, a lot of income inequality, a lot of the way things are structured, it affects people's access to certain things. And if you want to take it one step further, that's why people engage in crime. Like, that's the argument. It's a social adaptation for people who are in situations where they don't have access to certain things, or they don't have the opportunity, or they maybe are living with, unsupportive family members. And so when society is structured in a certain way and then you're living in a bad situation, you can't just say, oh, that person needs to pull their bootstraps up. It doesn't work that way. We're not on an even playing field. But in theory, obviously we need to be. But as you can see, even though we started with some, I would say somewhat good intentions, it hasn't worked out that way. It hasn't been translated that way. Because that's, unfortunately, humans are greedy sometimes. But I would say, at least here, the fact that those are the ideals that started this country, it's a lot easier to kind of check ourselves. But if you're in a country, like for example, my motherland of Iran, I mean, it's never been a sort of democracy or republic like it is here. It was a monarchy, and then it became a theology or theocracy. And so it's harder in that sort of situation to check yourself because the ideals of, speaking up and having freedom of speech are not inherent within Iranian laws or even Iranian culture. But for Americans, that's not the case. And so, in a lot of ways, we are at somewhat of an advantage because we have the ideals, even though historically it hasn't played out that way. And I mean, America is still fairly young in terms of, the inception. And so I feel like we're still in the stage of like progress and just kind of understanding who we are as a country. Whereas other countries that have been around for millennia, just the cultures are a lot longer, it's a lot harder to like check yourself and try to like shift because it's so deeply ingrained. America's very unique in that way. Okay, any questions? Move on. So, very similar to ethics of care, John Rawls also understood that moral development is something that you learn. It's gradually acquired during childhood. And there's three basic stages. The first one is morality of authority. Who is that referring to? What's your first point of contact of authority? Yes, exactly. So, I'm sorry?
Family.
Yeah, parents, siblings, grandparents maybe. But most of the time it's your parents, your caregiver, your primary caregiver. They explain the rules, the conduct, the reasons for why you did something wrong versus doing something bad. Or in theory, they explain them clearly. And they also exemplify the morality they teach their kids. You walk the walk, you don't just talk the talk. And so that's the morality of authority. Your first point of contact is within the home, your parents. Then, as you get older, it's the morality of association, the people you associate with. So, other family members, teachers at school, your friends at school, people in your neighborhood. So, from these individuals, you learn rights, duties, standards of behavior. And then you get a little older. So, I would say this is like early childhood. This is kind of like, late childhood, like early teens, teenage years. Like your friends, your peer group are really influential. And then when you start getting into young adulthood, you form deep attachments to certain individuals, maybe a spouse, a significant other, or communities. You might be a leader in a community, or you might just be embedded, like a university is its own community. And so all those individuals, communities, they follow moral standards that are reinforced by social approval or disapproval. And so through those three stages, once you become an adult, I would say probably in like your late 20s, early 30s, you start getting a sense of real who you are because up until that point, I mean, at least my experience, you might be a little confused. I mean, your brain doesn't stop developing until 25, so I really don't expect anyone to really know themselves up until that point. But even then, it takes some time. But I would say in your 30s at least, you really start to get a sense for who you are. And all of that came from your associations. And you start developing your own moral compass. Question? Yes, Seth.
Is this kind of overlap with the social monitoring?
Yeah, it's similar. That one was more geared towards understanding deviance, why people are antisocial. Theory focused a lot on your parents and just like how your parental interactions dictate whether or not you're pro-social versus antisocial. Yeah, good connection. Yes.
So
No, you're good.
when in staging life, like
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Very tired.
So like when in life communities they just replace it.
I mean, I would say these two, like, this is definitely childhood. This is like adolescence, like when you're in puberty, developing, you're kind of like finding your identity. But honestly, this last one could go on for years. I mean, like, you might know who you are, and then all of a sudden you turn like 50, and then you have like a crisis, an existential crisis. And maybe you go through a whole stage of just like quitting your job, finding another job, being, maybe you convert. You were Catholic, and all of a sudden you feel like Judaism is calling your name, and you convert and you start going to synagogue instead of a church. All these, and that's going to play into your own morality, so to say. So this, like the last one's an ongoing process, but I would say for most people, 30, 40s, that's when you like really start establishing that. And then, assuming that you haven't, you don't have some sort of like epiphany about like, oh, I haven't been authentic my whole life. But some people do, which is okay. It's part of life. You might go through another stage of that. That makes sense? Okay. All right. Any other questions, concerns? All right. Let's pivot now to applying ethics to actual law. So we've kind of talked about natural law or universal laws. They're just laws that most individuals consider natural behavior. And they define the right way to live. So what are some examples of something that's natural? What we all desire as human beings.
Food and money.
Yeah, so just basic human rights, having access to shelter, nourishment, money, which is also a sort of nourishment. Happiness, yes. The right to pursue your happiness. Right to property.
Basically, just like basic human needs. Basically.
Yeah, your basic human rights, even the Bill of Rights, protection, your property's protected, your body is protected. Like all of us, we don't want to be harmed. Hurting someone when it's not justified is not a natural thing. I mean, hurting, like being violent is not natural to humans, but in some situations it is necessary. But in most situations, it's not. It's not a common thing for most people. So yeah, things like that are natural. Basic human rights, natural. But some argue that using natural law, it can allow for a hybrid approach when it comes to justice, or just the theory of justice. So the hybrid approach takes into account the duties and the principles, like I said, with ethical formalism, and then assumes that rational people are naturally endowed, meaning that they have the capacity for reason and the capacity to identify goodness. So when we're looking at wars, a lot of wars are unjustified, but some wars are justified. What's a just war? When is war okay?
Never.
Well, yes, in theory, that's a good place to start from. But when is it okay to engage in combat?
Well, when somebody else attacks you, like self-defense.
Okay, so yeah, self-defense. So if you're a country and you're being attacked, you have every right to protect yourself.
It's like Pearl Harbor, they attacked us and then we struck back at them with the bomb.
Yes. So yeah, Pearl Harbor is one good example of that. We also attacked Japan too, so keep that in
They
mind.
attacked us.
Yeah, but that's where you start getting into the gray area. What is a just war? It's another example.
So like, isn't it like where you've exhausted all other possible ways of handling the conflict? I think there's like 3 of them that you can go through to make it a just war. Is that correct?
Yeah, but give me an example of a just war. What was Pearl Harbor related to? What war was that? Yeah, so World War II. Obviously, that was just because there was a genocide happening in Europe, and we didn't want that. And it wasn't just America; it was England, France, and so like a whole group of people coming against a sadistic, problematic person. That was justified war. What about World War One though? Was that justified? No, not really. It had nothing to do with protecting people. It was very political. Um, Vietnam War. A lot of people would argue that wasn't justified. We did not have any business going there. So there are certain examples. When there's like genocide involved, when people are being harmed and pushed out of their homes, that's a reason to start a war. But to start a war because of money and just oil, I didn't want to say it, but yes, oil, that is not justified. So that's kind of what we were speaking to last week or the week before, where certain things are legal, but they may not be ethical. Whereas, and vice versa, certain things are illegal, but they may be ethical. So just because it's a war doesn't necessarily mean it's bad or it's unjustified. In certain situations, it's necessary to do it. Even though we don't know what the outcome would have been if we didn't have World War II, I guarantee you it would not have been good for anyone.
So is that like, so you're saying, well, yeah, you're saying we had to engage in war to protect our freedom, basically.
In that situation, yeah, I would say World War II was pretty
And that's what
justified.
made war, okay, going back to your previous question.
So what?
To your previous question asking of wars, when is it okay to go back into war?
Yeah, is in a self-defense situation, to a certain extent. Yes, like for example, the Pearl Harbor one is good. Like, yeah, we were attacked by Japan, but I would say our response was a bit overboard because we used like gas and fire bombs, and we didn't attack a military base. We attacked literally the whole country, and Japan is still dealing with the consequences of Okinawa getting bombed or gas, basically.
Well, it's just a matter of establishing power.
Yeah, but my point is, but from an ethical standpoint, that may not be justified. Just because someone attacks you doesn't mean you go balls to the wall and just go crazy. Now I'm saying you can have your opinion, that's fine. But from an ethical standpoint, a lot of people argue that our actions were not justified just because of the scale of it. If we maybe met them with the same sort of violence that was met, maybe we can say that was equal. But it wasn't. But I don't even want to go down that road too far because that's one of the topics like politics. You just want to avoid people's just keep your opinion to yourself. But in certain situations, like I said, it's justified. So like we were very much justified to get involved in World War II and protect our harbor at that point because it was our property. Okay, any questions or concerns? All right, great. Let's do a dilemma. So, you are a new police officer and are talking with other officers before roll call. The group is loudly and energetically proposing various gruesome torture techniques to get suspects to confess to their crimes during interrogations. There is some hyperbole in the discussion, but also sincere belief that torture is justified in certain circumstances. So hyperbole just means like sarcasm. You're just like joking around. So they were joking, but there was sincere belief that torture is justified in certain circumstances. All right, so what's the problem?
They believe that torture is justified in certain circumstances.
Yes, so we want to figure out whether that is good or bad. And just, once again, you're a police officer. We're not at war. Okay, we are. police officers in a country that has laws, and like they're talking about gruesome torture techniques when you are interrogating suspects. So we want to figure out if that's good or bad. So what's the first? So that's it. So what's the first step? Let's go through that. We just reviewed the facts. That's the first step. What's the second step?
Identify what value for each party are relevant.
Good. So what's one major party here? You. Yeah, the police officers. So what values are relevant for police officers?
To not hurt people.
Okay.
To enforce the law,
Yeah, to
But-
enforce the law,
not like, go
not abuse it.
abuse it, yeah, exactly.
Yes.
That's what I was trying to say.
Yes, exactly. So those things are aligned. So enforce the law, protect society. Those are the common major values that most police officers, I hope. What's the other party though? Who are police officers dealing with? Yes, suspects. So what are the values of the suspects? To not be abused, to have their constitutional rights protected, to be treated innocent until proven guilty, right? And the only way you can be proven guilty is to go to court. So if it's happening during an investigation, no. You have to go to court. You have to be in front of a judge. You have to go through that process. So that's the due process rights. Right, so police officers, they have a duty to enforce the law, to protect society. The potential suspects, they want their rights protected and ensured. Great. What's the third step then? We've reviewed the facts. We've identified the values of each party.
Identify moral issues for each party.
Yes, so the moral issue. What's the moral issue here? For each party. What's the moral issue for the police officers?
Is torture?
Yeah, whether or not to use torture techniques. What's the moral issue for the suspects?
Oh, confess.
Yeah, to be
Being
honest or
forced
not.
to confess.
Right. Are you going to be honest or not? Are you going to tell a lie or not? Great. So we've gotten step 3. What's step 4?
What's the most immediate moral issue facing the individuals?
All right. Is it using torture techniques or being honest with police officers? What is the most immediate moral issue? Yeah, I would agree. So whether or not to use torture techniques is way more important to consider than is the suspect going to be truthful or not. Because we know a lot of that actually has to do with the police officer anyway, on whether or not someone is truthful. All right, great. What's the last step? Now what do? All right, we resolve the dilemma. So how do we resolve this dilemma? If we agree that torture techniques are the immediate moral issue here, what do?
Don't torture.
Why? Based on what? Based on what?
Based on the fact that you have an oath to uphold as a police officer and you have a duty there. And you have to observe the rights of the suspects.
Okay, great. So if we're using ethical formalism, that all aligns with ethical formalism. But let's take it one step further. What are those categorical imperatives? The first one is
Act on a maximum that you feel would be comfortable making universal law. So we
Alright.
don't want anyone universally tortured, right?
all right, good. You don't want torture techniques as universal law with law enforcement. Great. Second one.
Never use people for a means to an end. So
Good.
yeah,
So yeah,
basically don't torture them.
yeah, because torturing would kind of be you're kind of using them because it's like you need them to confess instead of like just naturally trying to figure out if they did the crime or not. You just want to close the case. You
Yeah,
know,
you
just
don't want to.
check it. Yeah.
Mhm.
And we don't want that. We want officers that are efficient at their job, that take it seriously. All right, good. And what's the third one?
That the actions that you choose, you're comfortable making that universal law.
Yeah, so if you're in a position of power, you were comfortable saying, we're not going to use torture techniques. That's what we've decided.
Anywhere in the world, right?
Yeah. All right, great. So the categorical imperatives were supported. We are comfortable not using torture as a universal law. It will allow us to not use people as a means to an end. And if I was like the president or something, I would be comfortable making that the law of the land. Good. So, other system, if we're using utilitarianism, we're producing the most happiness for the biggest number of people. Who are the people that we're interested in? Is it the police officers or the suspects?
I guess it'd be the suspects.
The suspects.
People are not police officers.
Yeah, because most individuals are just normal citizens. You know, the police officers are the smaller group. So the outcome could, if you use torture techniques, the outcome could potentially be what? And we know this from research. Guantanamo Bay was a great example. Yeah, people are just going to say what you want them to say so you can stop torturing them, so you can stop waterboarding them. So it's not good because the outcome is then going to be false confessions, and that's just going to make your job even harder. So although you are producing the happiness for the potential suspects, it's also good for the police officers not to use torture techniques, because you don't want to be a police officer that used that and got a false confession and just derailed the whole case. And now let's say the statute of limitations is passed and you can't even get the person that was responsible. Example. So even though ethical formalism is looking at the action, utilitarianism is looking at the outcome, it's both the same decision not to use torture techniques. And once again, just looking at using natural law, that makes sense because most humans want to be treated fairly. We have a constitution to protect us for a reason. And on top of that, research shows that you're not going to get good, like no one is truthful in situations like that. You're just going to say whatever you're going to say to end the pain of the torture. So yeah, torture techniques, not a good thing. I don't think in any circumstance. Okay, good. So we talked a lot about like abstract theory, the sort of like theoretical things you want to consider when you're making laws governing institutions. But the idea of justice is very much ingrained within American law. And all it really concerns is the right and interests over the needs of individuals. So you're not really focused on their needs, but rather the rights and the interests, which sometimes align with need, like food, shelter. But that's a right. Having access to shelter and food, that is a basic human right. But with justice, you're just focused on the rights and interests. It's also assumed, unfortunately, in most philosophies, that humans are not naturally generous, open-hearted, or fair. So we need this influence of justice even more because, I don't believe this personally, but these philosophers do, that we need to be controlled because we're not naturally good, generous people. So justice just refers to the quality of being impartial, fair, and just. And it's a right we have as a society to insist upon. I've heard so many times, like, it's not the criminal justice system, it's the criminal injustice system. And honestly, sometimes I agree. And we have every right to be vocal about that. We have every right to hold people in these positions to higher standards because we don't always get it right. It's a social experiment what we're doing. No one has the panacea to solve social problems. It's usually like you do something, you figure out whether it's working or not, and then you adjust. So we all have a right to vocalize the need to have justice, to call people out, especially people in power, law enforcement, correctional officers, wardens, judges, lawyers, because it concerns the rights of every person, the interests of every person. But it's also important to note that what is just and what is good is not necessarily the same. Can someone give an example? So what is just but not good?
What is just? But
Yeah,
not,
but not good.
just enough.
Because just because it's justice doesn't mean that it's necessarily a good thing. Yes.
Taxes.
There you go. That's a great example, honestly. So yeah, taxes, they're needed because, you know, it funds things in your neighborhood, your counties, your country. But it's not necessarily a good thing because a lot of times the government takes more, or, you know, some people may not feel justified that the government is taking their money. So that's one good example of, you know, it's just, but it may not necessarily, you may not think it's a good thing, but, you know, it's justified. What else?
I was
Yes.
thinking along the lines of like maybe guns.
Okay. How so?
Well, you know, police officers, you know, they use guns, and you know you have the right to defend yourself. I mean, guns, you know, they are a good thing, but you know, but sometimes I just don't think killing somebody is always justice.
Yeah, sure.
That kind of, or maybe just saying murder.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Or just like not everyone who has a gun should probably have a gun, even though we all agree that, you know, that's a right in this country that we enjoy, the right to bear arms. A lot of people argue that it's a little outdated, that it's just, it only made sense back in the Revolutionary War when, you know, you didn't know who was at your door, you know, and you were just like waiting there with a rifle. And so it may not make sense now, but it's in the Constitution. It is a right. You know, once again, we're interested in rights, interests. It's the rights and the interests that we have as Americans. I mean, my dad was a hunter. I grew up with guns in the house and, you know, all around. But my father knew how to use them, and he was very clear on the rules. And we understood as children. I mean, I went to the range with him. I learned how to use it as well. But I've seen people that have no business, no business having a gun. Like they're cleaning it and they haven't cleared the bullets, or you know they're just like at a range, just like pointing it. I've seen this so many times, just pointing it everywhere. And so yeah, that's just. It protects our rights and our interests as Americans, but it may not be good because that means that people that have no business having a gun sometimes get access to it. We also have the whole black market around guns. So like even the trying to control all this stuff is hard because it's become so ingrained in like just American cultures, like to have guns. You know, it's an ingrained thing, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just kind of gone a little out of control in certain areas. Okay, good. So in general, justice includes three related themes. And this is very inherent and apparent in our criminal justice system. So the ideals of fairness, which refers to treating, how you treat people. Equality, which refers to the way you treat people, but also the opportunities they have. Wealth, you know, access to jobs, equal shares. And then impartiality, which also refers to equal treatment. So all three of those themes are very inherent within our criminal justice system, but just in for the idea of justice in general, they're very important. So just to, you know, expand upon, because there's like nuance there. They could essentially be the same thing. But when I say fairness, I'm talking about the condition of being impartial, meaning you are allocating equal shares or equal opportunity. Like having access to good schools. That's one example of equal opportunity, fairness. I mean, Brown versus the school board in Alabama. I forgot what year. But that was a major Supreme Court case, and it was essentially fighting for fairness to get access. Black people can get access to the same universities as white people. So that's an example of fairness. Equality, that refers to the same value, rights, or treatment between all and in specific groups. So, like, poor people, mid class people, even though they may have different incomes, they still are treated the same. They still have the same rights, and they're still valued the same. Even if they don't necessarily have the same income, it shouldn't affect the way that they are seen and treated. And then impartiality, it refers to not favoring one party over another. So, like, this is huge if you're a judge. You want to keep all your bias at the door. So, let's say you really have a problem with blonde women for some reason. And every blonde woman that comes in front of you, you just get very triggered. That's not you being impartial. You need to see the blonde woman the same way as you see every other person. And so it's just not favoring one group over the other. So those are the specific definitions, but essentially it's all about treating people the same and making sure people have the same opportunities. I mean, the fact that you are all sitting in this classroom is a huge sign of progress because, not that long ago, less than 100 years ago, many of you would not have been, I wouldn't even be here as your professor. I would not be allowed. And so that's a sign of our progress. That's a sign that we have really tried to shift and fix the way we treat people in terms of the fairness, the equality, impartiality. Okay, any questions? Okay. Actually, I think, yeah, we'll do this and then we'll save the rest for next week. All right, so the origins of justice. Justice, the word comes from the Latin jus, which means concerning rules or law. The concept of it originated in the Greek word dike, which is associated with the concept of everything staying in its place. That's essentially what justice is, everything in its place, and everything in its own role. So one of the 4 civic virtues, according to Plato, who was a student of Aristotle, the person who developed ethics of care, but Plato too has very much been influential in American law. But justice is one of the cornerstones of just being a human. Does anyone know the other civic virtues? So justice, wisdom, courage, and temperance, which is patience. So those 3, along with justice, make up a virtuous human that can be in society with others. And it makes sense that Plato was so focused on virtues because he was a student of Aristotle and he was the person that developed ethics of virtue. So Aristotle himself talked a lot about justice, not only as a function of law, but what do you think Aristotle was applying justice to? Not the laws, but to what? If he's focused on individual virtue, what is he seeing justice as? Yes?
Morality?
Yeah, that it can be applied to an individual person and how they deal with other people in their life. So you too, it's not just like institutions are just. Individuals can also be just. Are you treating people with kindness, with fairness, equality? Because you could be a tyrant in your life and just bulldoze everyone and everyone hates you and you alienate everyone. That's not a just person, a person that just cares about themselves and never takes another person into consideration. That's unjust. And so it can also be applied to individuals, but at a higher level, institutions. And for criminal justice specifically, we are concerned with 2 types of justice, which we will talk about. We'll see how far I can get. All right, so distributive justice is one aspect of justice that as criminal justice students, you should be familiar with. And it concerns what measurements should be used to allocate society's resources. essentially are things proportional and equal, like income. Once again, access to schools, access to jobs. So things like affirmative action, welfare, free schooling, getting access to other goods and opportunities, and how society distributes them. That's distributive justice. In the word distributive, so it's allocation. Think of it that way. So we're really focused on goods a lot of times. Also having access to education, but certain things, but for a lot of times it's like the distribution of goods and what goods one can possess. So obviously, everyone has a valid claim to economic goods, your income, your property. But you also have opportunities for development. That's good. Like getting educated. Everyone sitting in this room, that's a form of distributive justice. Having citizenship to a country is also an opportunity for development, which you can categorize as a possession. But also being recognized, like getting like the Purple Heart, a recognition, getting honor, status. That's also a possession, like a valid claim to a possession. So when we're talking about distributive justice, that's what we're referring to. It's the possessions of an individual, whether it's economic, an opportunity for development or some sort of recognition. And the need for this type of justice arises out of the fact that inequality exists. That even though we've tried to create a situation where everyone's treated fairly, and equally, it doesn't always play out that way. So certain people have valid claims, meaning that they have a need and they deserve it, like welfare. Welfare is very much based on that assumption. Whether you agree with it or not, is based on the assumption that individuals in low income brackets, or maybe someone who suddenly lost their job, they have a need for income and government help, but they also deserve it because they are disadvantaged. It's not like they are in the 1%, making $1 million a year and they still have access to it. That wouldn't be fair. But so if you deserve it and there's a need, you have a valid claim to it. All right, and we will stop there. That are specific for criminal justice, what you as students of criminal justice should know. I was able to cover distributive justice. Who can remind the class what distributive justice refers to?
Something good.
Yes. So if you recall the previous slide 12, that's what we were referring to. And really, like I mentioned, what day is it today? Tuesday. That justice in general is focused on the need, not needs of an individual, but more the rights. But a lot of times the needs and rights go together. Like we need food, we need shelter. Shelter and food are also basic human rights. But there's this idea of entitlements. That's kind of where the need. So just because you need something doesn't necessarily mean you should have it or you necessarily deserve it. And so that's where and a lot of times there's like a conflict between what you need and like your merit, whether you're like worthy of receiving it. And in some situation, the need exceeds the merit, but it may not be justified. So for example, like an armored car driving through Miami, spilling a bunch of cash in an unprivileged area. Obviously, if it's an underprivileged area, the need is evident. Low income areas need money, but in terms of the merit, whether they deserve that money, is another question. Do they? So just a random car or armored car, those, I forgot what the company's called, but the armored cash cars where that transfer of money is from bank to bank. If it was just driving through your town and it accidentally was spilling money out the back, even if you're a low income person, you don't necessarily deserve that money. It's not yours. It doesn't belong to you. You didn't really do anything to earn it. It's kind of a form of stealing in a way. Not in a way, it is stealing. So that's one example. Just because you have a need doesn't mean you deserve something in that situation. Now, obviously, if you're working hard or you're giving your services, your time, then yes, you are valued and you deserve to get compensation for the service that you're giving people. But just because you're poor or you need something doesn't mean that in every situation you're going to deserve it. The context really does matter. And there's different schools of thought that have influenced people's thinking over time. So like if you're in the egalitarian camp, it focuses on equal shares for all, which is something that we want. But once again, equal shares in an ethical way and not something that is like unethical or where you're like using someone or taking something that's not yours. But if you are in the Marxist camp, you're going to focus on the need above the entitlement, above the desire to have something. Marxism is very much misunderstood, but it has influenced like communist systems. And in communism, it's all about the state. It's all about like the health of the state, which includes the individuals, but many times it translates into just people who have things versus people who don't. But Marxism, Karl Marx, he didn't really talk about that. Like people just took his idea and they kind of distorted it. But he really just emphasized helping people who have the need, the have-nots, the individuals who are in the lower income brackets. Those are the individuals, or just not even income, whatever need it is. Maybe you don't have access to good jobs, good schooling. Though the need for those individuals over is more important than like the entitlement or desire of any other group. If you're a libertarian, you're more focused on promoting freedom, like no interference from the government in social and economic spheres. So in that situation, you give more importance to merit over just need. And then utilitarianism or utilitarian theories. They focus on, once again, attempting to maximize benefits for individuals and society. So there's like a mixed emphasis on entitlement and needs. It's really just like the outcome. What is going to create the best benefit for all? So you don't necessarily have to know these theories for a test. But it's just good to know that there are, although we've all agreed upon like what distributive justice refers to, there's a lot of ways to view it, and there are a lot of, debates on like what is more important. Is need more important or is merit more important? Okay. Any questions on distributive justice? Another aspect of justice that we are very much concerned with as students of criminal justice is corrective justice. Aristotle identified corrective justice as the second form of justice. What are we referring to here?
When you say corrected, it means like correct way of doing.
Kinda. Gigi?
I want to say using corrective measures to change someone's I don't want to say opportunity, but to dissuade them from doing the same thing in the future.
Yeah, we're getting there, yes. So in general, corrective justice is just concerned with unfair advantage, minimizing the unfair advantage. You can also look at it as emphasis on equality and desert. Not the sweet kind of dessert, but dessert in the way that you deserve something. Your merit, once again. Fairness and impartiality. Those are the things which is like the crux of our criminal justice system is fairness and impartiality, equality. So those are the things that we are concerned with within corrective justice. But there are two components, and this is where the nuance is. So when we're talking about substantive justice, that's when we're focused on just deserts. So you can consider that retribution, an eye for an eye. You do something bad, you deserve to have a punishment put on you. But the punishment has to fit the crime. It has to be an appropriate amount. And like I said, one main philosophy that supports this is retribution, retributive justice. So under retribution, how do you usually treat people? I kind of just said it.
Eye for an eye.
Yeah, an eye for an eye. It's very straightforward. The Latin term is lex talionis, which just means an eye for an eye. So, for example, early laws, if you think about like the Roman Empire, if you go and steal a grape, usually what will happen to you is that you get your hand cut off. If I kill someone's child, I will have my child killed. Vice versa. Or I may die. So it's very like literal. You do something, the same sort of punishment will be applied to you. And it's all about trying to balance the victim's harm with the offender's pain or suffering. So if you created a lot of harm for an individual, under retribution, you deserve a lot of harm to be put back on you. Because that's kind of like balancing the scales. But the issue is, in a modern day society where we're trying to be progressive and treat people fairly, we can't just rely on retribution because there's really no aspect of reform or rehabilitation. And that's one important part of our criminal justice system. Most modern day criminal justice systems, if you want it to be effective, you need to think about reform. But there is no treatment or reform involved in the balancing of harm under retribution. What about mitigating factors? If we're going under retribution, do we care about mitigating factors?
No.
Yes. Overall, no. Except when it's adults versus children. That's really the only time. Because even under retribution, there's this assumption that you can't hold a child to the same standard as an adult. So that's really the only time where a different punishment can be given for the same crime, is if one offender is an adult and another offender is a child. Under retribution. Okay, and then utilitarian justice is the second philosophy that really influences substantive justice. If you're familiar with Cesar Beccaria, Jeremy Bentham, they are the philosophers that were kind of at the forefront of this rational thinking. That's basically what it's based on, is rational thinking, assuming that humans are rational beings and that we're making calculations of, how much pleasure will be produced versus how much pain will be produced before we commit a crime or something or before we make any decision. So essentially, you're punishing so you can deter offenders and other people from future crime. Deterrence is always the main goal in utilitarian justice. You're trying to prevent someone from committing crime and, making an example of them for others. That's why we used to hang people in town squares. It's like a classic form of general deterrence. It doesn't work. That's why we've stopped doing it. But in general, we found that there really is no general deterrent effect for the death penalty. People are going to kill who they're going to kill because it's a crime of passion. You're not sitting there thinking, oh, if I do this, I could get, life without parole, or like I could get the death penalty. No one is thinking that when they're about to kill someone. Most murders aren't even premeditated. It's like in the moment, heat, it's a crime of passion, the heat of the moment. You get triggered and all of a sudden you make a bad decision. Many times alcohol is involved or drugs, and someone dies. But anyway, I'm getting off topic. But for utilitarianism, that's just one example. Deterrence. That's what we're focused on, because there is this assumption that, once again, we're using this hedonistic calculus, that we are hedonistic creatures and all we care about is feeling good and maximizing our pleasure. So then, logically, if you're a rational person doing this, if committing a crime is going to cause more pain than it is pleasure, then the idea is that you won't commit that crime. But we know now with a lot of research that that's not the case, really. Deterrence or rationality is very much bounded. It is very person specific. It matters where you come from, your experiences. What seems rational to me may not be rational for you. But this is just kind of the thinking. This is the assumption that has influenced substantive justice. So once again, like really focused on deterrence, sentencing. So when a judge sentenced someone to life without the possibility of parole for a first-time non-violent drug offense, would you say that is fair? Why? Why does that not feel good?
Well, they didn't hurt anybody. They didn't hurt anybody.
Okay, so it was a non-violent crime, so putting them to death seems a bit much. Gigi, did you want to add something?
That he's not a repeat offender. This is the first time doing.
Yes, first-time non-violent offender. And there's a lot of research that those people are exactly the people you want to target because the likelihood of them reforming is high. And so giving someone like that the death penalty just doesn't make sense. It goes against the values and assumptions of substantive justice. The punishment does not fit the crime. There has to be a balance. But let's say that person was like, a spree killer. Like I'm thinking of the father and the son in DC, like, I don't even know, a decade ago, that were just like killing random people at gas stations or just like randomly out. I don't know about the son, but let's just focus on the adult father. If you give that person the death penalty, then yeah, most people, I mean, even myself, I'm not for the death penalty, but in situations like that, okay, like that's not egregious. That doesn't feel egregious. It feels, or even life without parole, just, without the possibility of ever leaving prison. And that makes sense because it's a violent person who has had repeated offenses, and the likelihood of them reforming might be low. So you wouldn't give that person community service and then the person who is the non-violent drug offender the death penalty. It just doesn't make sense. There's like an imbalance there. So that's all we care about with substantive justice is treatment and treatment of people within our system. On a practical scale, that's what we are focused on. Are the sentences we're giving fair? Are people actually being deterred? Are they effective? Those are the sort of things that you're concerned when it comes to substantive justice. Now, the second aspect of corrective justice is procedural justice. What does that refer to?
The due process.
Yes, exactly. So it's exemplified by due process. We all have due process rights as citizens of the United States. A right to to have a jury trial, a right to be notified when there's like evidence brought against you, a right to attorney. All these things are part of your due process. But so essentially anything that's like a constitutionally mandated procedure that's designed to eliminate error and any sort of protected liberty, life, or property. So also like right to cross-examination, statement of findings, the right to an appeal. Those are all things that you should have a right to if you're involved within the criminal justice system. It's not like, oh, you get arrested and nothing. There's no rights. So that means then that injustice doesn't come from the offender not deserving punishment, like it would in substantive justice, the injustice would come from what in this situation? Yes.
Not getting the due process.
Yes, exactly. So when an unfair procedure happens that violates someone's protected rights with liberty, life, or property, that's what we care about. That's when the injustice arises. Not, oh, they got sentenced 10 years when they should have got sentenced 4 years. That's not part of procedural justice. That would be a substantive justice issue. But if you got arrested and you didn't get your Miranda rights recited to you, and let's say that you didn't get to appear in front of a judge, you're just like in prison for 3 months before you saw a judge. That's a violation of your due process. You can't hold people in jail for 3 months before they see a judge. Like, it has to happen within like 48 hours. It has to happen fairly quickly. And if not, you're violating its unfair procedure. Okay, so corrective justice, once again, what is that referring to? Unfair advantage. And within that, there's potential unfair advantage when it comes to sentencing, how we're treating people. And then there's going to be potential unfair advantage in the process. What steps are we taking to sentence those people? Does that make sense? Okay, good. So when I say, name an aspect of corrective justice, make sure you talk about procedural justice, substantive justice. Don't just say corrective justice. You have to specify what aspect of it. All right. I want to talk about one form that's fairly new. It's not in your book, but restorative justice is a very, I would say it's contemporary, but it's been used quite a bit, especially, within the past 10, 20 years. And the focus here is on compensation rather than retribution. It's meeting the needs of all concerned. So we're really focused on community empowerment and development. I've seen this used a lot with like police, like local police offices that are trying to do some sort of like community outreach, or like there's like this district in Colorado, I forgot where. But instead of taking like juveniles that are just being delinquent and engaging in things they shouldn't be engaging in, instead of taking them to jail or like starting that formal process, they have like mediation circles where the officers, the community members, the child, their parents, they all sit and they figure out a good solution. So it empowers the community because they have a say in how that offender is treated, but it also helps our prison system because it diverts people that don't really need to be incarcerated. Like, kids do not need to be incarcerated. Most kids, I've never come across a situation where a child had to be incarcerated. Now, I'm not saying like for a little bit of time, maybe, but there are people in prison now that were incarcerated when they were kids, and and just dumb stuff, and it was violent crimes, but like 15-year-old child really can't be held accountable the same way that an adult can, especially when they've been abused and they're like coming from households that are not supportive. Those individuals have a lot of potential to reform, especially if you intervene early on. But putting them in prison without the possibility of parole doesn't really do anything. It does the opposite that you want. And so that's why as a system, we've recognized this issue. A lot of jurisdictions have changed, but there's still some places on certain crimes, if you're a juvenile, you're going to be treated like an adult. But that may not be needed just because of the potential of reform. And so that's why a lot of jurisdictions now are using restorative justice as an alternative to just sending someone to jail or prison. Because historically, as an American system, we have really just been concerned on punishment. But in the 1970s, that's when we started moving towards trying to like repair the harm, trying to reform, the rehabilitation aspect. Because the end goal should never be to punish someone. Because what happens if you're just focusing on punishment? I mean, you can look at our society now. What's happened?
Mass incarceration.
Mass incarceration. Have crime rates gone down?
No.
It's not like I got.
Pretty much the same.
Yeah, well, violent crime has been going down, but in general, especially since COVID, we've been seeing spikes. So there's really been no change in crime rates, but even more importantly, there's no change in recidivism. It's been the same. 70% of people will be back within 3 years. I've heard that statistics literally since I was in undergrad, really, even before I started college, probably. And so that's the problem. When you're just focusing on punishment, you are not getting to the root cause of crime, which is not these people are bad, they deserve to be punished. That's not the cause of crime. What causes crime? Most crime. We're not talking about Ted Bundy. We're talking about normal, most people.
And not having a support system and getting out and then going right back.
Yes, the reasons why people engage in crime is because they're trying to adapt to some shitty situations in their life. A lot of times it's poverty, abuse, drug addiction, bad families, little support, no support from your neighborhood, your community. And so that's why everyone in prison is a low income individual, no matter their race, no matter their gender, they are poor. So there's a war waged on poor people, really. So when you're just focused on punishment, you're not getting at the root problem, which is poverty, which is trauma, family issues, like family stuff is such a leading cause of crime. If we just focused on, the income issue and families, I guarantee you their crime problem would be pretty much resolved. But there's no will to do it from either side politically, there's just like constant misinformation and let's just get tough on crime. But that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, we've been doing it since the 80s and we've just wasted a lot of money and just created more harm. So that's why we want to, and the fact that we're even using something like this is a good sign. I'm not saying that it's all doom and gloom, but we still have a lot of work to do. But the fact that there are police officers, police agencies, court jurisdictions that are recognizing that there needs to be alternatives to like the traditional, just punish them, is a good sign. Because really under this, we just view crime as natural human error, which that's really all it is. Most people are not psychopaths. They're not sociopaths. They're not out there just trying to harm people for the sake of harming people. That kind of person is like once in a blue moon. It's like 1% of the population will engage in offending like that, where they're just habitual, violent, serial killers. But most people, they're doing it for a very logical reason. It's either to, cope with some sort of inner conflict that's happening, or cope with the fact that they don't have any money and they can't find a job, or they can't, they find a job, but maybe there's other barriers, and just basic things like having low self-confidence, like not feeling good enough. Those things also very much play into, especially for men, why they persist in just cycles of offending. And women too, they just don't feel good enough. They don't feel like they deserve anything other than what they've got. So that's all they're going to keep doing. And so really, it's a call to love that person, not just punish them and hit them over the head. And that doesn't mean don't punish them, because obviously discipline, having standards, like we want that. But you punish so you can reform. You don't punish just to punish and to make them, feel bad about themselves and to just be living in a cell where it's basically a war zone. Some prisons, that's how messed up it is. It's just, not all prisons, but if we're talking about like high security, prisons where there is a lot of violence between the COs and the inmates, you know, they've created it themselves. It's not just like a natural thing that happens. Like, you have to be very intentional to create an environment like that. If you guys are familiar with that Zimbardo prison experiment that happened in the 80s, California, yeah. So that's basically what happened. He was a psychology professor at Stanford, and for his class, he like did this experiment where half the class were COs, the other class were the inmates, and it literally played out like we see now, where it's just like this power imbalance. The COs are really abusive, not respecting the inmates, and then like it's just like the same sort of dynamics that we see in certain prisons. And so that means that it's a very sort of psychological thing that we're like all creating, and it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. You just have to be a little bit more aware of what's happening. But there's that culture of like, oh, I'm a correctional officer and you're an inmate, so it's a us versus them. I got to protect my own. I'm not going to be concerned about you. I mean, that's the attitude in, like once again, not all prisons, but a lot of prisons, a lot of correctional officers, they kind of just get desensitized because that's the culture that they're walking into. Okay. Any questions on